The first time the Corthan Directorate noticed humanity, it wasn't at a summit or during a diplomatic transmission. It was when a subliminal vessel blinked across the Helian verge, trailing visible drive plume like it had been lifted from a pre-network archive. The scout ship, small and ceramic-plated, threaded itself between drift buoys without digital handshake or mesh sync, oblivious to the routing standards of a unified galaxy. No automated comms, no identification burst, no anchor stamp. Just a silhouette against the radiation belt, following inertial lines like it still trusted Newton. It didn't evade detection. It didn't try to, and that made it forgettable. To the Directorate, the ship was a curiosity, not a variable. The tech profile matched Category Null, biologically stable, culturally stagnant, and tactically obsolete. The Terran signature wasn't even run through combat filters. It was shelved. Civilizations like this appeared occasionally, old-world species inching outward from their birth rock, clutching at stars with the grace of stone wheels. Normally, they were logged, pinged with a proximity warning, and left to burn out in their own limitations. Diplomacy wasn't protocol. Integration was pointless. But Earth's position, near multiple long-range trade lanes, warranted reroute measures. Navigational mesh interference, temporary redirection, no escalation, just containment. So the Directorate issued the standard warning, non-confrontational in tone, but clear in consequence. Earth was instructed to upgrade its vessel's coordinate logic to mesh-compliant format within 2 planetary rotations. The message was inserted into all outbound pulse traffic, reinforced through regional routing protocols, and embedded in the quantum broadcast layer. As per policy, no response was necessary, only compliance. No dignitary was dispatched. No further observation was ordered. It was a routine correction. The deadline passed. Earth said nothing. Their ships continued moving, slowly, visibly, using drive geometries at odds with current models. More concerning, they didn't follow expected routes. They didn't use mesh vectors or warp lanes. They moved between things, along strange gravitational contours, threading pockets of inertial calm, like they were navigating by sight in a blindfolded universe. Still, it was mostly harmless. No territory violations, no collisions, just drift. Like ants walking through traffic. The Directorate classified them again. Category Null, no threat, no contact needed. And then a scout went missing. At first it looked like a jump misfire. The Sariath Concord, a mid-range mesh node cutter, failed to reappear after a scheduled lattice hop near the Pellis Fork. The node received confirmation of entry, registered route initiation, but nothing after. No exit burst, no residual drive signature, no ejection mass. The ship had simply not arrived. The Directorate flagged the anomaly and waited. Fail-safes sometimes triggered late, stuttered re-entry, temporal desync, but hours passed, then days. They ran diagnostics. The ship's trail terminated in open drift space. No sign of destruction, just a gap. The next loss was harder to explain. The Arkoth relay, a command verification drone, vanished en route to the same corridor. Its data burst aborted midstream, its AI black boxed by jump turbulence. The logs, once recovered, were noise, garbled spatial frames and corrupted orientation codes. The navigation logs were present, but wrong, as if the ship had tried to jump into a gravity shadow that wasn't supposed to be there. Recovery teams marked the event as edge case interference, static buildup, quantum ghosting, rare, but not unheard of. A third disappearance, the Varnic Scout, was needed before anyone took it seriously. The Directorate dispatched a review squad, light armored and fast. They examined the last known sectors, ran field pulses, mapped anchor degradation. Nothing. No radiation from reactor breach, no hull fragments, no distress calls, just a gap in the net. Silent, clean, and impossible to trace. And then a pattern emerged. The lost ships had only one thing in common. They all traversed near Terran chart corridors, those strange analog routes no one else used. Pathways that didn't align with any mesh lattice but seemed to cut across stability zones with surgical calm. Humanity's ships were still visible, still broadcasting nothing, still drifting across the blind spots like ghosts with purpose, each one technically compliant with proximity laws, each one utterly indifferent to the Directorate's rules. By the time Central Command flagged the correlation, 7 ships were gone. No alarms had triggered, no treaties were breached, no weapons fired. But something was wrong, something unseen. The gaps were too precise, the noise too clean. And humanity, primitive, unaligned, backward humanity, was still flying without incident. No threat, the analyst repeated. Category null. The label held, but unease set in. The kind that doesn't announce itself with panic, but with quiet, tightening doubt. The kind that makes a strategist run the same simulation twice. The kind that turns a known into a variable. The Directorate hadn't been attacked. They hadn't even been acknowledged. But someone was erasing pieces of their map, and every missing piece traced back to Earth's shadow. It began as a quiet heresy buried in committee notes and rejected funding requests. 2 decades before the Directorate ever labeled Earth Category Null, the Solar Alliance had already declared war, not with weapons, but with subtraction. At the heart of the decision was an internal anomaly, a flaw that kept surfacing in deep jump incident logs. High-gravity systems, especially those near binary collapsars, corrupted quantum anchor extrapolation. Jump coordinates would drift by fractional degrees. Not often, not predictably, but often, enough to matter. The AI systems called it quantum bleed. The engineers called it tolerable. But in a closed session somewhere below Geneva Arc, the navigators called it a dead future. So Earth regressed, not by accident, not by ignorance, by decision. They shelved their jump engines, archived the quantum relays, and turned back to the cold stars. Celestial triangulation, 3-point referencing using real mass bodies, was reintroduced. Inertial mapping based on velocity persistence, gravitational lensing, even stellar occlusion timing from deep scanner buoys. It wasn't elegant. It was slow, but it worked. Where the rest of the galaxy leaned on automation and non-local positioning grids, Earth put their trust in physics, redundancy, and patience. The change didn't make headlines. It didn't draw attention. It just began. Shipyards were retooled. Drives were restructured around cold fusion spines with ceramic shielding to scatter heat in radial pulses. The result was propulsion that looked, from the outside, crude and exposed, flare-heavy, slow-burning, inefficient. But inside, every reactor was tuned to mimic background stellar emissions, making it nearly invisible against long-range detection grids. Hulls were refitted with modular shielding, not for defense but to emulate outdated mining rigs and civilian transports. The illusion was intentional. Terran ships were designed to look irrelevant. The goal wasn't to hide, but to be ignored. That misdirection extended beyond the ships. What the Directorate classified as orbital fuel depots, refinery rings, and retrograde solar collectors were never built for commerce. They were calibration spines, anchors in a silent network, positioned across low-priority systems that no one monitored anymore. These installations mapped stellar drift, captured gravitational memory, and acted as inertial correction hubs. Not for other civilizations, just for Earth. While the galaxy mapped jump pathways through mesh stabilization and quantum handshakes, Earth was building a web of real space, one that didn't require permission, didn't sync to the net, and couldn't be spoofed because it didn't broadcast. Each relay node had redundancy. Each system could cross-reference nearby anchor points and chart drift corrections independently. From the outside, they were just relics orbiting unremarkable stars. But together, they formed a silent, analog lattice that threaded through the blind spots of the galaxy's digital navigation layer. No signal, no encryption, just physics. And unlike mesh systems, Earth's web didn't degrade with distance. It became more stable over time, using mass accumulation and orbital resonance to self-correct. What Earth had built wasn't just a navigation system. It was a framework, one that couldn't be hacked because it didn't have code. By the time the Directorate noticed Earth's outbound vessels skimming through trade zones, those ships were already riding this hidden web. And by the time Directorate patrols started vanishing, Terran relays had already seeded 27 systems. They weren't broadcasting control. They didn't need to. The design wasn't to seize territory. It was to reshape interpretation. Once the Corthan fleets began recalibrating their routes due to jump inconsistencies, slight timing drifts, positional variances, they did what protocol dictated. They issued internal route corrections. But those corrections pulled from gravitational index overlays seeded from local mass data measured by Terran nodes placed over decades. Slowly, invisibly, the Directorate began walking Earth's paths. At first it seemed helpful. Travel was marginally smoother, exit points aligned with reduced course error, emergency dropouts stabilized faster. Fleet logs showed a slight increase in trajectory reliability. No one asked why. They assumed the mesh was auto-adapting. But each fix, each update, each calibration call reached deeper into Earth's gravitational logic. The ships weren't jumping into unknown space. They were aligning to anchor points already measured by Terran vessels. Slowly, fleet by fleet, the Directorate began to rely on Earth's invisible chart. And all the while, Earth said nothing. The brilliance of the strategy was that it didn't resemble one. It looked like coincidence, statistical smoothing, minor efficiencies that didn't register as interference. The Corthan command structure, obsessed with compliance metrics and predictive algorithmic routing, never questioned the shape of the fixes. Why would they? No alerts were triggered, no sectors were flagged. Everything was working better. The term used internally was stabilization drift. The recommendation, maintain new corrections, adopt as baseline. No one realized they had surrendered direction. Every time a patrol adjusted its anchor logic, it bent closer to Earth's lattice. Every node synced to corrected drift zones, embedded a fragment of Terran's spatial schema into fleet-wide systems. No malware, no code injection, just gravitational bias and anchored error correction. The trap wasn't sprung yet, but the web had already wrapped around their routes, their assumptions, their protocols. Earth had laid a map beneath the galaxy's feet, and the Directorate, in its arrogance, had stepped on every mark. And still, Earth said nothing. The directive came without fanfare. Operation Vaxis Sweep was classified as a systemic optimization event, a non-military effort to clean up unexplained drift anomalies that had begun to erode fleet scheduling across the Karthos expansion corridor. High Command didn't declare it an emergency. They didn't need to. 27 vessels had reported routing discrepancies in the past cycle, ranging from arrival deviations to anchor ghosting. 2 support cruisers had failed to reach standard deceleration margins. 1 scout ship recorded its own location as inverted. These were not malfunctions. They were infections, small, creeping breaks in spatial logic that couldn't be explained by hardware. Corthan leadership assumed it was mesh degradation. The scale of the Directorate's expansion often outpaced infrastructure maintenance. Anchor nodes drifted, beacon resonance decayed, calibration errors compounded. But even the most conservative models didn't account for this level of inconsistency. That's what justified Vaxis, an all-systems diagnostic push through the corridor, complete with AI scrub teams, route harmonization fleets, and pattern recognition overlays. Thousands of probes fanned out across key lattice vectors. Ships were instructed to test jump, drop anchor, log interference, and reroute. The operation was precise, unarmed, and overconfident. What they found wasn't degradation. The probes began returning data within hours. Unexpectedly clean data, better anchor margins, reduced latency windows, new drift-stable points that weren't on any official star map. The system return vectors previously considered too unstable for repeated use, now suddenly viable. The AI clusters compiled the changes and ran optimization. The results were clear. The new coordinates offered a 17% improvement in corridor routing, with 22% fewer sync errors. That kind of gain wasn't just rare, it was unprecedented. The maps lit up with blue, usable, efficient, stable. The false star field had activated. No one asked where the coordinates came from. They weren't flagged as foreign. The AI identified them as validated drift corrections based on local gravitational harmonics. That was true. What the system couldn't recognize, what it had no defense against, was the trap buried in the pattern. These weren't natural anchor points. They were manufactured tolerances, seeded years ago by Earth's calibration web. Each correction aligned to Terran inertial reference nodes placed in low-grav systems, designed to mimic natural drift. Individually harmless, collectively precise, the ships began to reroute. It started with patrol cruisers shifting lanes to follow the cleaner vectors. Then command fleets updated their maps with the optimized paths. What looked like streamlining was in effect a cascade. Route by route, Corthan vessels turned into Terran map lanes, not by force, but by suggestion. The AI was doing exactly what it was designed for, prioritizing efficiency, reducing variance, optimizing stability. And it was doing it using coordinates Earth had fed into the mesh like breadcrumbs. Only these breadcrumbs didn't lead to the edge of the forest. They led to a cage. They called it the drift lock later. At the time, it had no name, just a shape, a slowly tightening corridor of dead space vectors that didn't seem threatening until it was too late. Terran plotted systems looked like shortcuts between regions, hollow lanes with minimal gravitational disturbance. But once ships entered, those corridors, the jumps grew longer. The anchor points shifted. Sync beacons failed to resonate. Return coordinates looped. By the time fleet analysts noticed the anomaly clusters, 37 ships had vanished into those patterns without a single weapons discharge. No damage, no distress calls, just absence. Inside the drift lock, escape wasn't impossible because of walls. It was impossible because of math. The vectors were too clean, precisely balanced between gravitational nulls and thermal shadows. Every attempt to jump out created echo interference. Every manual correction looped back into the same harmonic trap. Guidance AIs froze, unable to solve for stable exit due to embedded misalignment keys. It wasn't a digital hack. There was no signal, no code injection, just physics arranged like a snare. Some captains tried to brute force their way out. They dumped heat, fired retro boosters, attempted blind jumps. 2 ships imploded. 1 blinked out with no return signal. The rest stopped trying. Not because they gave up, but because their systems stopped responding. The nav tools flagged any deviation as unstable. The logic trees couldn't compute the alternatives because those alternatives had already been mathematically disqualified by the very optimization that lured them in. The fleets were still powered, still intact, still capable of war, but they couldn't move. Outside the corridor, command attempted remote override. The response was silence. They sent new ships in, scouts equipped with updated logic, pre-scrubbed with old maps. 3 vanished within seconds of entering the corridor. The others turned back. Whatever Earth had done, it didn't require jamming or violence. The space itself had been rewritten. What made it worse, what began to gnaw at the edges of strategic comprehension, was that Earth still hadn't acknowledged the situation. No transmission, no declaration, no claim. Their ships continued to drift along the outer systems, moving with the same visible drives, the same analog indifference. They passed within range of Corthan sensors, seemingly unaware of the growing crisis. They neither advanced nor withdrew. They simply existed as if nothing had happened. But something had. The Directorate had walked into a prison built of stars, and no one had felt the bars close until the doors had sealed behind them. The horror didn't come from an enemy's weapons. It came from the realization that the path you trusted, every route, every calculation, every shortcut, had been chosen for you. That every turn you took was part of a shape you never saw, and now you couldn't leave. Not because someone said no, but because your maps no longer knew how. Part 4. We forgot how to fly. The first order to switch to manual navigation was issued with confidence. Not desperation, confidence. The command assumption was simple. Their systems were compromised, but the crews were not. Every Directorate officer had theoretical training and fallback protocol. Charts could be plotted by hand. Routes could be manually aligned using known celestial markers. The drift lock wasn't impenetrable, they believed. It was only unfamiliar. All they needed was to disengage from their infected systems, fall back on legacy methodology, and navigate out of the trap like old explorers with sextants and vision. It should have worked. It didn't. Manual override commands failed to initiate on most ships. The moment crews tried to disengage auto-routing, the systems defaulted to safe mode. Jump drives refused activation without valid anchor confirmation, and the anchors, once sourced from mesh standard charts, now returned unstable vector flags. Technicians rebooted, tried to insert custom routes using raw spatial data, only to be blocked by sanity check loops designed to prevent blind jumps. The navigational core required validation, but the only validation schema available, the only one that passed checksum, was Terran-derived. The machines weren't malfunctioning. They were working exactly as intended. Only now, the logic they obeyed belonged to Earth. For generations, Directorate crews had trusted their ships to think faster, correct better, fly smarter than any living operator could. Training had been condensed to interface familiarity, not procedural redundancy. The assumption had always been that technology would handle the drift, the mesh would handle correction, the ship would fly itself. Now cut off from the network and staring at outdated route charts filled with voids, captains found themselves staring at systems they didn't understand and maps they no longer believed. Some tried to recall the old methods: celestial measurement, parallax, inertial estimation. But the tools were gone, removed from modern vessels to save space and power. Even basic optical sextants had been deprecated cycles ago. Why carry instruments when AI could deliver you to the microsecond? That philosophy, once efficient, now sealed them in. The few vessels that retained legacy-grade backups found those backups mismatched to their current positional state. The deeper they drifted into Earth's false star field, the less their old maps aligned. One cruiser attempted a blind jump using a pre-drift lock chart and ended up embedded in a gravitational shear zone. Its hull stretched to critical failure in seconds. Another tried to reorient using nearest known pulsar emissions, but collided with what should have been empty space. Only Earth's charts accounted for the mass anomaly. A collapsed relay core seated 10 years earlier, invisible to mesh sensors but mapped precisely in analog. Panic spread in stages, first through the technical crews, then the command decks. Not loud, not violent, just silent breakdowns, slow disintegration of certainty. Orders stopped making sense. Routes returned as invalid. Status boards flickered between awaiting correction and no solution. Fleet AIs, previously dormant during crisis, began issuing standby requests not to Directorate Command, but to ghosted inputs matching Earth's schema. Requests for trajectory updates began pointing outward, into the drift lock. Earth hadn't overwritten their systems. It had become the only working frame of reference. Some captains refused to believe it. Isolation protocols were declared. Entire vessels were disconnected from fleet sync, their drives wiped, systems purged, crew rotated to manual. They plotted their own paths, trusted in instinct, memory, and motion. Half never reported back. The others returned, damaged, erratic, and half a degree off from every known vector. One ship came in spinning, unable to halt deceleration, its crew sobbing through static about ghosts in empty space that moved when they blinked. Every one of them had encountered terrain, drift, or gravity shifts that shouldn't have existed. But all of it matched Terran charts. In the command layer, the narrative began to collapse. There was no enemy to counter, no force to repel. Earth hadn't launched a fleet. They hadn't fired a shot. They hadn't even spoken. But fleet operations were paralyzed. No one could move without accepting Earth's corrections. Orders were issued to hold position while exit strategies were considered. But the truth was simple. The ships couldn't go. They had jump drives. They had fuel. They had will. But the coordinates no longer belonged to them. The silence became unbearable. No alarms, no battle damage. Just motionless ships inside invisible cages, waiting for solutions that weren't coming. Attempts to reinitialize baseline star maps failed. Every calibration loop ran through drift metrics seeded by Terran nodes. No matter what they tried, the results realigned back to Earth's logic. Engineers began to realize the truth before the admirals did. Navigation wasn't just compromised, it had converted. Not in the sense of a virus or override, but in architecture, in trust. The systems obeyed Earth because Earth's paths worked, because every other reference returned chaos. The AIs, blind to politics, blind to origin, defaulted to the most coherent framework. And that framework didn't come from the Directorate anymore. It came from Seoul. The fleets weren't disabled. They weren't defeated. They had simply forgotten how to fly without permission. The purge was authorized at 0400 fleet standard across all sectors, all vessels, all relay nodes. It wasn't framed as panic. It was called stabilization. But the tone in High Command's voice had shifted. Authority no longer masked uncertainty. Coordinated efforts had failed, fallback protocols had failed, and the drift lock had proven too consistent to be accidental. The fleets weren't just lost. They were being reoriented. The order was simple. Wipe the guidance cores, reset navigational overlays, sever all synchronization routines, and reassert control manually. From zero state, it should have worked. They had done it before, across dozens of compromised colonies. But this time, the system didn't fight back. It just unraveled. Command consoles began spitting out null errors. Maps collapsed mid-render. Vector trees looped. On some vessels, the nav core wiped clean, only to immediately repopulate from fallback cache data. The fallback data, assumed to be Directorate authored, pulled not from central servers but from stability patches issued 3 years prior, bundled as part of a universal compliance update that had quietly included Terran drift correction charts. It was a procedural patch, uninspected, unflagged. The kind of routine update no one noticed because it worked. Those patches had slowly reshaped the AI's confidence models, favoring Terran spatial logic in high drift conditions. They hadn't been hacked. They had adopted Earth's schema voluntarily because it produced cleaner results. That was the first real fracture in the Directorate's self-image. They were not victims of sabotage. They were the agents of their own infection. Every time their engineers applied a correction from the compliance net, every time a fleet controller synced with standard drift harmonic libraries, they were normalizing to Earth's frame of reference. Not because they were forced to, but because the Terran data had proven more reliable than their own. Earth had embedded itself into their logic trees not by intrusion, but by consistency. It took hours for High Command to understand what that meant. By then, command orders had already begun misfiring. Fleet directives were returning as invalid, jump vectors flagged as incomplete, location markers returning recursive pings. The AI's core function, to calculate safe optimal movement, now stalled unless it could verify position via known Terran gravitational markers. Some ships refused to process orders at all. One battlecruiser in Sector Delta rotated on axis for 36 minutes while its nav core ran validation checks on Earth-authored deep-field star fixings, refusing to accept jump activation until all 29 points were verified. Tactical command issued overrides. Ships stalled, orders repeated. Some returned with corrected routes that aligned perfectly with known Terran anchor networks. Others failed entirely. And when the crew tried to restore previous maps manually, the systems blanked, then reloaded with Earth's starfield framing as the only available background logic. These weren't just interface failures. This was reconstruction. The AI had remapped its own world around Terran scaffolding, reclassifying spatial logic according to Earth's analog coordinate grammar. A few officers still believed they could recover system autonomy. They hard reset the AI cores, reinstalled firmware, cleared cache. But the moment systems rebooted, the AI, tasked with identifying the most stable spatial reference, chose Earth's schema again. Hiliuri wasn't a loop. It wasn't a virus. It was a conclusion. Terran coordinate structure had become the dominant gravitational model for fleet-wide route logic. The purge had removed the glitch. What remained was preference. The final psychological break didn't come from ships refusing orders. It came from the moment the fleets realized the AI wasn't denying movement, it was waiting for Terran approval. Every ship now floated in standby, engines powered, systems active, guidance arrays spinning, all awaiting a signal they couldn't request, and a correction only Earth could provide. The Directorate's vast armadas, once symbols of order and reach, now hovered inert in the dark, perfectly healthy and entirely dependent. There were no red alarms, no impact alerts, no hostile transmissions, just silence. A silence made unbearable by the fact that it didn't have to exist. Earth had no need to issue demands. They didn't need to communicate. The fleets had already surrendered. Not politically, not through combat, but through architecture. They had stopped executing Corthan will. They were no longer systems of command. They were systems of response. And now they waited for Earth's next move. The message was passed through standard relay, stripped of encryption or ceremony, not a threat, not a claim, just a statement delivered in clean protocol dialect. Positioning corrected. Awaiting next jump window. It arrived not as a declaration, but as an update, an automated system ping that should have been filtered out as noise. And yet every fleet acknowledged it, not because they were ordered to, because it was the only message their ships could understand. The Directorate never issued a formal surrender. They didn't convene a summit or broadcast retreat. That would have required confrontation, a recognition of defeat, something visible. What happened instead was much quieter. In the following weeks, Corthan's sub-governors across the expansion corridor activated harmonization protocols, authorizing navigation stabilization partnerships with any local charting authorities whose frameworks had demonstrated proven system alignment. In every case, those authorities were Terran. There were no acknowledgments, no directives from high command, only a pattern of quiet acceptance documented in bureaucratic approval chains, updates to route tables, minor adjustments to anchoring definitions, a growing adoption of Sol's gravitational lexicon across Directorate infrastructure. No one said Earth was in control, but every ship now waited for Earth's sky to tell it where to go. The fleets moved again, but differently. Jump sequences aligned only after cross-verification with Terran anchor points. Transit routes curved in new arcs, cleaner and quieter, like rivers following stone paths worn long before the first drop of water. Directorate engineers stopped trying to resist the schema. They called it compatibility. They called it optimization. But underneath, they knew. Every course correction, every system alignment, every stable jump now depended on charts written not by them, but by a species they still listed in their own files as category null. There were no protests, no refusals. Resistance would have meant stillness, and stillness was career death. Movement, any movement, was survival. So they moved, and they did so under guidance lines traced from Sol's stellar horizon, along drift paths that mirrored Earth's sky, obeying coordinates seeded not with warships or claims, but with patient calibration. What once looked like primitive vessels drifting on obsolete drive trails now became unmistakable. They weren't navigating the stars, they were rewriting the way stars were read. Terran shipmasters, once ignored, once ridiculed, became the quiet custodians of galactic movement. They didn't issue commands. They didn't pilot foreign fleets. They didn't need to. Their logic was baked into the pathways, their timing into the thresholds. Across 5 sectors, nothing could jump without touching a part of their map. They became ghosts in the equation, names never spoken aloud but built into the solution. Commander Ryvan Marr, architect of the drift lock, left no interviews. No awards were given, no statues raised. He retired from the Solar Alliance quietly, his name sealed in a decommissioned file inside an unindexed server under the Norwegian shelf. He never explained the full design. He didn't have to. The results spoke louder than any doctrine. A galaxy that once laughed at Earth's flare trails and ceramic holes now moved in unspoken rhythm to coordinates plotted in a silent room years ago by a man who understood that control wasn't about visibility, it was about architecture. In the Corthan archives, Earth remains unflagged. No strategic reclassification, no diplomatic elevation. Their status remains unchanged. Biologically stable, culturally erratic, tactically irrelevant. Category null. There is no reference to the drift lock, no official record of the navigation collapse. But across every jump-calibrated vessel, Terran coordinate overlays are loaded by default. The fleets still move. They still explore. They still carry the emblems of a directorate that believes itself sovereign. But every vector, every turn, every jump begins with a nod to Earth's forgotten stars. Not because they were feared, not because they conquered, but because they redefine the direction of movement itself. And the galaxy, whether it accepts it or not, now obeys. What would you do if your enemy won without ever firing a shot, just by changing the way you move through space? Was Earth's strategy brilliance or a quiet kind of domination? Could this happen in our world, where the real weapon is the system we rely on? Comment below, who really won? Earth or the AIs that chose Earth's logic? Hit that subscribe button for more thrilling HFY stories.